Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Today, I am going to look at our economic growth and ask this question, whether our economic growth has been inclusive. I am asking this question of, when I am talking about inclusive growth, what I have in mind is not growth which is transformative. We can also talk about transformative growth when the society is churned up and a new kind of a social order emerges. That I am not, there is a hope that we attain a casteless and classless society, which will mean that we will attain, we will transform our traditional society into a modern one. I think this modernization project has not succeeded. I am only talking about inclusive growth. That means the extent to which the economic opportunities have affected the various castes and communities, and to what extent it has drawn them into the economic processes in such a way that their not only participation in the economy goes up, their contribution also is enhanced. For that, in order to assess this, whether our economic growth has been inclusive, so I am looking at that both from the point of view of the emerging structure of the economy and the emerging social structure. I will talk about both these things and see how this and this correlate or interact. This is my agenda today. So that we will be able to make a judgment about the nature of economic growth we are experiencing. Now, if you look at the emerging structure of economic growth, there is a very big surprise. This is no longer a surprise. This structure that I have identified is not a surprise at all, because many people, this structure has emerged over the last 2 decades actually. Why it is surprising is, usually when the pattern of economic growth, especially in the developed countries, was such that first, before development, the primary sector would be dominant. All right, when development picks up, it is the secondary sector, all right, that becomes dominant, and then the tertiary sector that becomes dominant. Primary sector refers to agriculture and mining activities and all that. Secondary sector refers to manufacturing, industries, and the very act of producing things, producing our goods or services, goods in factories and so on. And the tertiary sector refers to the services that are produced. Usually, as as the economy grows, services, at a later stage of development, services become dominant because, as with modern science and technology, with the growth of modern science and technology, the economy gets transformed into a knowledge economy. That is, it is based on more and more on scientific knowledge, on the application of scientific knowledge and technical expertise and so on, and not so much on manufacturing, on factories and so on. All right. So, this is the kind of a trend in economic development that one witnessed, one anticipated, and this was the trend of economic development in the developed countries of the West. But in India, what we seem to have done is, we have moved directly from the primary sector to the tertiary sector. Our tertiary, the labor force engaged in the tertiary sector is around 35, it may now even be 40%. This is on the basis of 2012 data. The secondary sector, manufacturing sector, has sort of lagged behind. So, this in itself raises questions of employment and employability. The kind of earlier it used to be argued that the peasant will become the worker. From rural area there will be urbanization, peasants will move to industries, they become industrial workers, and then after they become industrial workers, then at a later stage, that the economy is transformed into a service providing economy. Services, basically it's not the amount of capital that you invest in machines that matter. It is more your capital is your knowledge, the knowledge that you have possessed and the skills that you have possessed. The human capital becomes more important. That is what economists would anticipate as the course of development. As we notice, our secondary sector has lagged behind, all right, and the tertiary sector is bloating up. What is very interesting is that agriculture sustains 48% of the population. So, what we find here is very interesting, that we seem to have skipped the stage of development when the manufacturing sector bulges, and only subsequently we are supposed to have the tertiary sector grow, tertiary sector growing. That means, if the manufacturing sector burgeons, industrial workers will be larger in number, and as I said earlier, that there will be migration there will be rapid urbanization, migration from rural areas to urban areas, peasants will become workers, and then it is that knowledge workers as a category would emerge. But while this is India seems to have missed this, with the growth of the manufacturing sector, becoming the major engine of our economic growth. Instead of which, it is the tertiary sector, especially that of services. And the services, the information technology sector, all right, IT sector, has been a major, has pulled the other sectors of the economy upwards. So, this is one way in which to look at. I think we need to understand the consequences of this type of growth, all right, this type of development. Now, the second thing is, along with this this structure, we can also look at the economic structure, emerging economic structure, in terms of what is called the organized and the unorganized sector. Organized and unorganized sectors, all right, or is also sometimes they use the term formal and informal sector. All right. When you look at, when you talk about organized sector, it is the sector which comes under the rules and regulations that the government has imposed. For instance, you want to open a shop, all right, in a town, all right, you have to register yourself under the Shops and Establishments Act. And if you, since you are going to transact in retail business, maybe you need to now register under GST. So the government will, you'll have to report to the government, you know, to the tax authorities how much you earn and how much tax you have collected, and you're passing on, and so on and so forth. Similarly, you know, in the organized sector, when the factories working in the organized sectors, they come under Factory Act, which regulates the number of working hours and the working conditions of the workers. There is a stipulation of, the workers cannot be asked to work for more than 8 hours a day, and if you do it, you'll have to give extra compensation. And then there are rules about leave of the workers, leave benefits to the workers, and so on and so forth. So there are many parts of our economy are regulated tax structure by the fact that they have to, in order to carry on business, they'll be consuming electricity, they'll have to get permission for, license from the government to, have electric supply, water supply, and so on and so forth. So you do come under the purview of the government. But there is an unorganized sector. For instance, in very many, small cities on pavement, there are, carts selling all, various types of goods, plastic goods, clothes, dolls, and all kinds of things. And they, sometimes they may even tap electricity from the, electrical lines, and they may not pay any money for that, all right, any, charge for that. And that, they somehow escape the law in a big way, and that's the unorganized sector. For instance, handicrafts also come in this, cottage industries, and then agriculture. Agriculture, 53% of the population is still dependent on agriculture. Agriculture is basically an unorganized sector, and there is no tax, income tax also. So, it's totally an unorganized sector. So, this is also called formal sector. This organized sector is called formal sector, and the unorganized sector is called informal, because the relationships that obtain are basically informal relationships. They are not defined by, government's rules and regulations. So this is these are the. So if you look at the structure of the economy in this fashion, we all know that only 10% of our economy is really comes under the organized sector. Big corporations, small, medium industries and small industries which are registered, which have got a plot from the government, and which are getting certain concessions from the loans from the government, they all come under the formal sector. And there is the informal sector constitutes 90%, it absorbs 90% of the population, of the workforce in the country, all right. Although the informal sector's contribution is not very high to the to the GDP. Now, not more than about 30 or 40%, but the point that I am trying to make is that if you look at this also, you find that the informal sector bulges. Naturally, in the informal sector, capital requirements are very little. You can set up a roadside dhaba for, a small roadside dhaba for very little capital, all right. So, what the informal sector is dominated by the services, and there the informal sector also has different types of work relations. There are self-employed people like pakoda makers, pakoda sellers, or tea, chai walas, all right. Or for instance, there are people who are working in home-based industries, as I was mentioning the other day, women who are working at home and contributing to the economy. But this is there are home-based industries like beedi rolling and agarbatti, rolling and all these things, and embroidery. One can list several other such home-based industries. For instance, even electronic components, assembling them sometimes are given out. This is called putting out system, where the workers at home are given the raw materials, all right, and asked to work on the raw materials and give the output. In the case of agarbatti making, they will give them the sticks, and then they will give them the, in matchbox also, in matches industries also they do that. So that's one. And then there is also in the informal sector, there can be a place, a kind of a workshop where workers assemble. For instance, this garment industry. In the garment industry, work is parceled out to an exporter of garments of a particular style. He parcels out. He orders to several entrepreneurs, who in turn buy the cloth, get the cloth from the factories concerned, and then engage tailors. And you will see them quite often in cities, huddled in small, unventilated rooms, working away, huddled over their, sewing machines and working away, or cutting cloth, and so on and so forth. This is also another type of unorganized sector activity. And there is also contract workers, contract laborers. There are casual laborers, there are contract laborers, and then there are contract laborers means a contractor goes to a village and says, how many able-bodied men are there? Here, come along. I'll get you your daily wage of 400 or 500 rupees. You come and sit in the truck. I'll take you, all right, to the place of work. It may be an agricultural, it may be an agricultural plot where you you have to cut sugarcane or harvest or do something else, or plant, do the implant, that transplantation of rice, or and so on. So there are there are varieties of labor relations that obtain in the informal sector. And basically, it's based on how do you recruit workers. Of course, I should also mention here construction industry. Construction industry is contributing considerably to the significantly. I think it employs about 10 to 12% of the labor force is actively engaged in construction industry. Mostly they are in the informal sector, because the contractors who build buildings, recruit labor contractors who get the laborers to come and do the job. So this is the kind of, this is a very variegated sector of the economy, and this, the very this is the very fact that there is this kind of informality, is in a way very, very interesting, especially today, because we thought that as the market expands, gradually the informal market expands into the villages and to the towns, and as it expands, more and more of the economic sectors would come into the, would come under the operation of the market, and therefore, and as it happens, as capitalism expands, you will find that the informal sector, reduces and the formal sector grows. But in our country, ever since development, there has been a stagnation. Formal sector has not really, developed, as expected, by leaps and bounds. Now, why is this the case? There is another point I want to make. These are not watertight compartments. These are not watertight compartments. There are relationships. They are interrelated. That is another important feature. For instance, the chicken workers of Lucknow, maybe in the informal sector, their product may ultimately, through a distributor market, export house, may ultimately reach the fashionable fashion designers who design clothes, and then ultimately they become highly priced items in the in the international market, just as diamonds, for instance. So designers, when they work on the when they produce diamonds, cut diamonds, and produce different shapes of jewelry, different types of jewelry, all right, then they acquire an international reputation or brand name, and they are sold all over the world at fabulous prices. But what I am trying to say is, so there are interconnections between the two, and very interestingly, I suspect these interconnections feed, the informal sector feeds the formal sector. I suspect that the informal sector, not suspect, I think this is right. So long as there is the informal sector subsidizes the formal sector, because they can get work done at low prices and then take them to the market and charge at high price. For instance, this I was talking about chicken workers, their embroidery. Now you take their produce and to a fashion designer. The fashion designer designs the cloth, the dress, and then when it is sold, much of the profit goes to when that dress is marketed. For instance, even this your Nike shoes, all right, Reebok shoes, all these things are done in the informal sector. Then they get sold in the markets for fabulous prices, and the point is that the people who make the large amount of money are those who design these products, who are selling the large, say the export houses and so on. Whereas the workers in the unorganized sector get a measly daily wage. That too, barely enough to for them to live. All right. And there are, of course, there are variations. I don't want to spend too much time on describing the nature of the informal sector. There are, women workers are hired. Women workers are kept in hostels, all right, and they are looked after, and their security. The hostels become like prisons, and then every morning they are transported by bus to a place where there is, there's a textile unit or something, and there, they are made to work for 8 hours, and then they return back to the hostel, and then their money may not be given directly to them. Their wages, monthly wages, will be given to their husbands who come and collect them. So there are various types. And in this informal sector, mostly women and child labor. Child labor is banned, but children are employed, and therefore this informal sector is exploited by the formal sector. Even as I am saying this, there are instances of people, self-employed people, enterprises which are making, which have become enormously successful, and they have moved from the informal sector to the formal sector because they become extremely successful. Like for instance, if somebody is making pakodas so well, he gains a reputation all over the city, then people come and throng at his shop, and when he earns this reputation, he will make lots of money. Or even panwalas, all right, they make a lot of money, and then they open up bigger shops and bigger units, and then they come into the organized sector. Usually for them because they are not highly educated, for them to become successful, they'll have to wait for their younger generation, their sons, better educated sons or daughters, to come and take over the family business. But be that as it may, there are spectacular successes, and there are in some niches of the unorganized sector, there are enormous possibilities of becoming extremely successful and prosperous. That you should not there are for instance some skilled mechanics, all right, who are so skilled that even because of their ability, or for instance cameramen, all right, video cameramen, they are so highly skilled, they are so reputed for their technology that they get earn an international reputation. So are hairdressers, for instance. There are one can give numerous examples like that. So, but broadly, the organized sector exploits it. Another thing that's very interesting here, I want to mention, is that the organized sector can also use, not only exploit, can use, is convenient, so long as there are informal relations, there is the informal sector, the organized sector can use the informal sector to its advantage. I will give you some examples. For instance, just the other day, I came across, there was a news item, you might have all come to know about it, that somebody who was living in a chawl in Mumbai was the director of one of these firms which has been raided, diamond jewelry firms which has been raided. And his address is given as a director, and his son says his father received 1 lakh of rupees from these people for signing on a form, and he did this, and he never attended their meetings, and now he is held responsible for the embezzlement that that this big firm is supposed to is also held responsible for the embezzlement, of money loans that they had taken from banks, from public sector banks. So what I am trying to say, and this is one, and then there are there was another instance of a very famous firm in Mumbai, one a minister's driver, all right, happened to be with the director of the firm. Although he continued his business as he continued his occupation as a driver. He was basically a driver. He was also a director. You can say that, well, it's an instance of spectacular mobility, but it's not, because one can give numerous examples. For instance, there are firms which are notorious for money laundering. They have made huge piles of money, but the money has all gone into the name of one of the directors of the firm, who is a retired man. These are all real life instances. Who is a retired couple actually, and it's supposed to go to them, but the couple have written a will, willing their entire property to the person who has made him the director of that firm. So, in order to avoid taxes, you can use the informal sector in order to avoid repaying loans. In order to avoid taxes, you can use the informal sector effectively. Even the firms in the corporate sector, there are reports that they are also resorting to these techniques. That is, therefore, it is if informal sector continues to flourish, it's also because of the links that organized the formal sector has with the informal sector. Now, related to this, I've already talked about how money can be laundered. You don't have to pay the taxes that you should legitimately have paid. You don't have to return the loans through the use of informal sector. All right, your links with the informal sector, and also there are there's a shady area. There are, for instance, one heard that during the days of demonetization, one heard that one way of converting your black money into legitimate money was to use the cooperative banks, because farmers' cooperative banks, because those cooperative banks have come under the regulations there are more relaxed than that of formal commercial banks. So they use it's reported that cooperative banks were extensively used for converting black money, ill-gotten wealth into legitimate money. That is one. Now, as I am talking about it, I easily slipped into the topic of black money. This topic of black money leads to the topic of corruption. And if you look at the economy, if you split the economy in terms of black economy and the legitimate economy, some economists say that the black economy is as big, if not bigger, than the legitimate economy. So all the data that you have about GDP and others will have to be revised if we also take into account the transactions that go on in the informal, in the illegal transactions that go on in the economy. These illegal transactions can be both in the informal sector and in the formal sector, and people can use the informal sector to park their funds. This is also possible. So and then another thing I want to mention here, when you are talking of the organized sector, nowadays it is becoming extremely difficult to regulate the organized sector. It's usually the state is supposed to, a good state, a state that governs well, is supposed to regulate the corporations and make them pay their taxes. Of course, now we have introduced, the government is emphasizing on digitalization of the economy. They want to reduce cash transactions, so that the more and more transactions, if they are done through credit cards and through electronic banking and so on, then it will be difficult for people to escape the law, the regulatory authorities. And similarly, GST is supposed to bring in a vast sector of the economy which is now outside the taxation system, and enhance the tax revenues of the government. But then the problem is, can the government regulate the so-called corporate sector, the corporations? That is a very big question today, because looking at the scams that are occurring, in collusion with bankers, in collusion with other political authorities and so on, and also the way in which the corporations are structured, it is very difficult for governments to it's very easy for the corporate sector to escape the surveillance through one device or the other. There's very many. The corporate sector, because they are corporate, they are huge corporations, they can find numerous ways of fudging accounts. Usually accounts, the balance sheet is supposed to be, every corporation, public limited corporation, is supposed to give the balance sheet of the company to the registrar of companies. Now the balance sheet, instead of revealing, it hides the operations of companies. So what happens is that there are techniques, accounting techniques, there are techniques of legitimately opening head offices and opening new branches, changing incorporating new companies and so on. Through them you can organize a conduit in such a way that the money that you are supposed to pay as tax goes, or the money you have received as bribe easily goes into channels which cannot be traced effectively, especially if some time passes in the and by the time the government comes to detect it, it's already too late. Anyway, so I am talking about this, I am talking about the emerging economic structure to point out that the role of the state, the state is in a very difficult situation. It is supposed to effectively govern and regulate the economy, but its capacity to regulate is getting limited because of what they call crony capitalism. This is because, and that is because there are there is the notion that if you bring in more capital. If foreign direct investment comes into India, India's economic growth will go up, employment opportunities will expand and so on. But with this, with these, the way some of these corporations work, all right, you will, that investments, even if investments come, it's not in direct investments are there, it may not really, contribute to the kind of economic growth that was once envisaged. All right. Now, the point is that we have evolved with the and then one last point I want to mention in this. Now, technology has advanced so much that you can bypass the government entirely, because you can bypass the government entirely. There are these cryptocurrencies. You might have heard of. I am not sure how it works. It's all through internet transactions. You can buy and sell Bitcoin, for instance. That's one of the cryptocurrencies. You can buy and sell cryptocurrencies and use the cryptocurrencies to buy from abroad whatever you want. All right. It's very difficult for the government to track the transactions. It's very difficult for the government to track how much you have bought cryptocoin. Cryptocoin in itself, its value keeps going up and down. So it's very difficult for the government to know how much the government may come to know how much you've invested, because it may force you to declare that. But apart from that, how much you have made, it will not be able to assess, because the transactions are, there is this that technology that they use is such that it is transparent to those who are inside the system. They can track every transaction, all right, but at the same time those who are outside the system cannot you cannot understand where the money, where the your currency that you have sold, where it has gone, who has bought it, and so on. So if this is the case, with cryptocurrencies are a danger to governance itself, and they can and not only danger to, they are danger to governance for yet another reason. Cryptocurrencies can do transactions at much cheaper rate than than what a government currency can do, because it's entirely this thing based on the internet, based on computer programming. It can at least the government has to print notes. That will be some. That will be expensive. In cryptocoin, it is only notional. You don't really have any notes. The circulation, need not be in terms of notes, currency. So it saves on that bit of transaction, all right, that portion of the transaction. It saves on transactions in numerous ways. So it's actually, cryptocurrencies are actually challenging governance in a very big way. So what I am trying to say in all this is that we are moving into a new era where governments, the state, instead of sitting at the top and watching all that's happening, the government is now its powers to do surveillance is getting its power to govern effectively and efficiently. That's the demand of the day, is getting reduced considerably. Having talked about this economic structure this way, I think it should not come as a surprise that in India there is, there are sharp inequalities. The top 1% of the Indian economy, of Indians, own about 72% of national wealth. This is an enormous amount for 1%. That means the remaining 99% own only 28% of nation's wealth. You see that there is a big gap emerging, all right, and it proves the point that it sort of indirectly supports the position that the Commission on Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector, took, that that nearly 78% of India consists of poor and vulnerable segments of the society. So you will be able to understand why this is there has been inequality. And then one very important point that I have to make. One of the what shall I say, one of the dynamic features of capitalism, dynamic features of competitive market, is that whenever there is competition, when there is capital market, then the profit that is made is somehow a kind of a legitimate, it is really for the risk that you have taken. One can argue that the profit that I make in investing in a company to make, for instance, televisions, all right, that I take the risk, I get money from others, I put in my own money, I hire workers, I organize them, I produce, I get raw materials, and ultimately I start producing televisions, and my televisions turn out to be, I've hired a technologist who has brought in new technology, and as a result, when I get my profits, I can say my profits are the reward for my the risk I've taken, or the reward for my organizing, all right, the entire production chain. My profit is my reward for employing workers and giving them wages, all right, and so on. So you can sort of say, that profit is a morally appropriate, morally right, reward for the enterprise, the risk I've taken, or the reward for my organizing, all right, the entire production chain. My profit is my reward for employing workers and giving them wages, all right, and so on. So you can sort of say, that profit is a morally appropriate, morally right, reward for the enterprise, for your enterprise. But today, the structure of capitalism that we have is such that by, without really exerting any effort, all right, just through speculation, all right, or just because you are privy to some vital information, that the government, your friend in the government, has announced that licenses will be issued for your for this 2G, all right, spectrum, 2G spectrum. So what that because the concerned minister or concerned bureaucrat is your friend, you can get him to inform you early about how the auction is going to be done, or you can influence him to auction to adopt, not auctioning, but adopt the system of first come first serve basis, and then use that advantage to to apply first to be the first to apply for the license and get the license, and without doing much work, you know that the price of this license will be enormous in the market. You go and sell it in the market and make 100,000 times more money than the money that you have given the government for the license. So this is perfectly possible. What I am trying to say is, now as capitalism is developing, there are more and more opportunities. These are called rent seeking opportunities. These opportunities are increasing enormously in the economy, as a result of which, the moral legitimacy of capitalism is now coming under very big, under a big question mark. And I think it's possible, to stem the rot, but that requires the cooperation of international cooperation. That requires a world organization which monitors transactions from across the from international which monitors transactions across national barriers, and it ensures that there is ethical economic practices, that ethical economic practices are adopted, and those unethical practices are penalized substantially. But as of now, I do not see that kind of a organizational structure, although there is the WTO, which controls, which has a say about foreign investment, providing equal opportunity for all foreign investors in all the countries and so on. Yet, I don't think we have reached a stage where that a world organization can come up to regulate the global economy. And in this context, it's also necessary that some of the major economies, emerging economies, are not really interested, can use their clout and their capacity and their economic the power that they have because of their wealth and because of the bigness of their economies. They can sort of subvert any attempt to regulate at a global level, regulate economic activities at the global level, especially if it hurts their interests. So, all in all, when I recounted how the economy is the structure of the economy is changing, it is clear that this structure is not really particularly conducive for inclusion. And in this context, I should also mention that the engine of economic growth, capitalism, all over the world, is an engine which is constantly, it's not including, it's not an inclusive engine, it is constantly producing, excluding different segments of the population. There are people who are, in America, for instance, the President Trump came to power because he said that we we will not allow the we will not allow India to sort of take away our for instance, President Trump came to power by saying that he will not allow their work to be exported to India and other countries. He was, one of the major complaints in America is that their workers are being thrown out of employment, and the work is shifting to, India and other developing countries where the wages are low. So their workers are getting unemployed, and our workers in India are getting employed. So he said that we will prevent that from happening. We will insist on our industries to produce their things here. All right. This is one of the things. And then he also wanted to prevent workers migrating from other countries, because that also will reduce the wages of the local workers. So they don't allow skilled unskilled workers to come into America, and they regulate very closely monitor immigration, so that only highly skilled workers who are not easily available in America can come into the country. All right. So the point that I am trying to make out is, there in America this exclusion works this way. In India too, exclusion works in several ways. Now, for instance, with factories getting, if they get automated, workers who are working in the factories are thrown out of job. Similarly, exclusion works when, till now, there used to be people who were setting up a shop with a Xerox machine, all right, and they were earning their livelihood, all right. Now there is this with Xerox machines becoming cheap, printers becoming cheap. All that you have to do is you don't have to go to those shops at all. So those people who are self-employed will be thrown out of jobs. So there are the process of economic growth itself is a process that is generating exclusion of vast sections of the society. So given this, I think it's an enormously difficult task for us to ensure there is inclusive growth. Okay.